So one of the things that we need to think about when doing TIAs is how to deal with the situations where you aren't meeting a zoning bylaw, or when there's site constraints that mean that there's something that you're not going to be able to do that the relevant authority would like you to do. And this sort of comes down to making a case, I suppose. Thinking about how you, in your transportation impact assessment, are going to assess whether what is proposed is reasonable, whether you yourself as a traffic engineer are comfortable with it and think that it is reasonable design, and then also how you're going to be able to tell other people that yes, this is reasonable. How you're going to be able to prove that this is the case. So the first part, assessing whether it's reasonable in your own mind, that's something that you would have to do before you would agree to write the traffic impact statement. I would be putting to you, because there's not much point you being on board with the client if the client is proposing to develop something that you yourself believe is fundamentally unreasonable or unsafe. You have some professional ethical responsibilities as a learned engineer. This ties back to many jurisdictions you will be licensed, but even then, through your skills and training, you have a responsibility, an ethical responsibility to act in the public's interest, even though you are being paid by a client. Someone is paying for your work, be it the government if you're working as a city engineer, or whether it's a private client. You still have ethical responsibilities to the larger public, which is part of being an engineer, and very important. So that's sort of something to keep in mind when you're doing TIA sort of work, is that just because your client wants it doesn't mean that you have to agree with it, and your reputation will very much be made or broken on what you are willing and not willing to support. And you can help your clients by pushing them in the right directions, and also being quite clear as to what you would like to have and also what you must have for your support. Anyway, moving on, how are you actually going to make a case for something that you do support? How are you going to put this forward in a transportation impact assessment to show that something that you are supporting is reasonable? Well, here's our example. We're moving back to parking provision, because parking is often an area in which a case needs to be made. You would have noticed our earlier discussion of Donald Shoup and the problems of very, very large off-street parking requirements. And I suppose the first thing to do is to look at what you are actually proposing and make a case that yes, this is pretty reasonable. So in this case here, the total parking requirement is 201 spaces. And so be upfront, tell them what the shortfall is. There's a shortfall of 101 spaces, and the effective supply ratio is 0.23 spaces per unit on average. So what does that mean? Well, here we go. Here's the bit where this report is actually talking about why this proposed parking, which is below the zoning bylaw, is reasonable and appropriate. So there's a lot of sections in this report. It starts off at the very big picture, talking about climate change and action plans, and how having a lower parking supply will mean that more people will walk and cycle because they therefore won't have a car on site, so on and so forth. And then moving down, this is much later in this section in the report where we're looking at what the actual recent trends have been, because zoning bylaws are sort of the initial standard. This is the, you must get a permit if you are going to go below this standard sometimes. Sometimes the zoning bylaw hasn't changed for very many, many years and society's moved on. And so here, through parking sales data, you can see that there's a the recent approval trends is talking about how So that's in section 4.3.4, how there's been a general surrounding approvals. So many other of the residential buildings around the area have been approved with similarly low parking requirements. I haven't shown it, but there's a whole section in there, 4.3.4, which has a huge amount of data looking at different different buildings that have been approved and how this building is similar to them, and so on and so forth. Here we go into 4.3.6.1, and so now it's much more looking at the actual building itself and starting to talk about, well, these are the number of units that have been sold off the plan. These are the number of units who have bought, these are the number of people who bought a unit and a parking space. And this is how many things are left over. So in this case, they actually haven't offered parking to the very small units, 1 bedrooms and smaller. And so that of course will change the way the market goes. And then of course, if you want to buy a unit and a parking space, it's going to cost you more money than if you just bought a unit. But fundamentally, if there are unsold parking spaces at the end, someone's going to have to foot the bill for those parking spaces because everything costs money. This, I suppose, is quite progressive, having the idea of having units and parking spaces sold separately. In many cases, the unit is sold with the parking space that has been required by the zoning bylaw. And so, yeah, when you buy a unit, you bought yourself a parking space as well. You can't buy a unit without. And so that probably, again, ties back to the Donald Shoup stuff we were talking about, whereas are there people out there who want to buy units without parking? Yes. Should they be forced to buy parking spaces that they won't need? Probably not. Anyway, the fundamental thing that it all comes down to at the end of the day is that given in this particular case, given the parking supply is going to actually meet what they are anticipating as the need, even though their estimate of the need is lower than the bylaw requirements, the basic story at the end of the day is there won't be any impacts to parking elsewhere. All of the parking can be contained within the site, which is fundamentally what most people are interested in this zoning bylaw type environment, where you are looking at is your proposed development reasonable? Well, if all of the vehicles that are going to come to that site can be accommodated within the bounds of the site, well, it sounds pretty reasonable. And then I suppose in traffic you'll have the same thing. Is, you know, if all of the vehicles can come and go from the site and without having significant impacts on existing road users, well, that sounds pretty reasonable. And so that's how you've been building up these arguments essentially for what you're proposing is reasonable.